Cornelius Vanderbilt, fabulously wealthy, ruthless in business, and often hard on his family, was once asked the question, how much money is enough? His response, always a little more. Always a little more. Anybody familiar with that quote? Have you heard that before? Vanderbilt, how much money is enough? He said, always a little more. Vanderbilt's comment, though perhaps delivered tongue-in-cheek, it is said that there was a little twinkle in his eye when he made that response, it probably displays, though, a complete misunderstanding of the meaning of the word enough. If you always need a little more, there is never enough, right? I would venture a guess, and perhaps you would agree, that such a misunderstanding has contributed to some, at least, of our present economic situation in our country and our world. The idea that Cornelius Vanderbilt articulated, that we always want or believe we need a little more, is nothing new, right? And it's not just kids who say, I have lots of toys and I want some more, or, you know, I have one lollipop and I want 100. It's not just kids, it's adults too, right? Only the price of our toys are usually a little bit higher for adults. It seems to be somehow hardwired into the American DNA. Sometimes we speak of this desire for more and say that it began maybe in the boom years after World War II, or perhaps even more recently in the prosperous 1990s. But let me share a quote from a 19th century political philosopher, French political philosopher actually, who came to visit in America. This is what Alexis de Tocqueville, and pardon my mutilation of the name, I never took French, observed about his stay in America. He said this, Americans are extremely eager in the pursuit of immediate material pleasures and are always discontented with the position that they occupy. They think about nothing but ways of changing their lot and bettering it. For people in this frame of mind, every new way of getting wealth more quickly, every machine which lessens work, every means of diminishing the cost of production, every invention which makes pleasures easier or greater, seems the most magnificent accomplishment of the human mind. One usually finds that the love of money is either the chief or secondary motive at the bottom of everything the Americans do. This gives a family likeness to all their passions and soon makes them wearisome to contemplate. That was written in the 1800s. But doesn't it sound like it could have been yesterday? Could have been yesterday, but it was the 1800s. So hold this observation about our national culture up to the short portions of Scripture that we heard this morning from various places in the Bible. First, from 1 Timothy. Some people, eager for money, it says, have wandered from their faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. One way to wander from our faith is to forget who is our Creator, who is the object of our worship. Exchanging material gain for a focus on God can only bring grief, and it is self-inflicted, isn't it? The writer of Ecclesiastes reminds us that if we love money, we'll never be satisfied. There will never be enough, as Cornelius Vanderbilt said so long ago when asked how much was enough. And Jesus brings us home, reminding us that when we focus in the wrong place, we exchange profit for life. What will you give, Jesus asks, in return for your life? Those of you who have read the study book that we're using for the Enough series have probably already read this story, but let me share it with everyone. This is one of those truth is stranger than fiction stories. Several years ago, the Royal Bank of Scotland sent an offer for a gold MasterCard. That happens often enough. We get credit card offers. There was a gold MasterCard that was offered to Monty Slater. The card came with a $20,000 credit limit, and that's pretty good for somebody who was getting a first credit card, don't you think? A $20,000 credit limit. Especially when you consider that Monty Slater is a dog. I don't mean, that's not descriptive of a person, really a dog, a real dog, a Shih Tzu to be more precise, that's the kind of a dog. Raymond, Monty's owner, thought about using the card to pay for some of Monty's favorite treats, since it had been offered, but he reconsidered, thinking that Monty was not in a position to pay back the balance when it came due, and that it might negatively affect Monty's credit rating in the future, and so he decided not to do that. This might be really funny if it wasn't true. It actually happened. And if it didn't illustrate a sobering truth, that we live in a world that encourages us, all of us, to live beyond our means. We are regularly bombarded with ways to have it now and pay for it later. Good stewardship, as Christians understand it, which involves healthy doses of saving and sharing, is unknown to many and is seen as quaint, old-fashioned, and hopelessly out of touch to others. Save up so you can pay for something? That's just silly, isn't it? We've all been there, or most of us anyway. We want the latest gadgets. We want the things with the most features. I'll tell on myself. Several years back, I wanted to get a new sewing machine. When I was in college, I had made a lot of my dresses for dances, as well as many other things. And in the intervening years, I had developed a fascination for quilting. I like useful arts, I like pottery and quilts and things like that, and I wanted to quilt. I owned a sewing machine. It was a hand-me-down black Singer in a little carrying case. It had been given by my grandmother to my mother and by my mother to me, and I still had that sewing machine. It's the one that I used in college. It worked, it went forward and backward, but nothing fancy, and it was really old. It was officially designated an antique. Dick agreed that I could have a new sewing machine that wasn't antique, and we began looking for one for my birthday that year. I had never looked for a sewing machine before. Remember, I was a third-generation owner of a little black Singer sewing machine. I had no idea how many neat things there are on sewing machines, things that had been added since Mimi had bought the old black Singer. It was overwhelming. I had bobbins in my eyes, all the things to look at, all the things that could be on a sewing machine, all the things that it could do almost by just looking at it. It seemed really cool. Egged on by a couple of accomplished sewers in the congregation, I settled on what I wanted, and Dick said, okay, that sounds like a good birthday present. I now have a beautiful Bernina sewing machine, and you can usually find it collecting dust in a corner in my basement. I've made a few things, a couple of Halloween costumes, some pillow covers, a few other things, but I've never made a quilt. And truth be told, I don't know what to do with an awful lot of those fancy little features that this sewing machine has. And most of what I've done could probably have been done just as well on what my antique little black Singer sewing machine. But I just had to have a new machine. Anybody ever been there? I won't ask. A fancy one. I know that I'm not alone. I bet most of you could tell a story like that. We are a country full of people who trade cars only a few years old and run just fine, who look into closets loaded with clothes and complain that we just have nothing to wear. And most of us can point at someone who's a lot worse than we are, right? Isn't that what we usually do? Well, so-and-so is a whole lot worse than we are. Let me caution you to be careful about that with judging. In this, like everything else, we are in a position to judge only ourselves. In 12-step programs, one of the steps is to take a fearless moral inventory of yourself. That's what it says. A caution is always given that you can't take somebody else's inventory. That's the truth. Only we know how much we make and how much we waste and how much we give away. Only we know that. We know what we do and don't need, and we know if we're out of control or in a good balance. And we know this about ourselves. We do not know it about others, even if we think we do. For example, there was a pastor who invited a missionary to speak at his church about social justice and ministry with the poor. As the pastor and the missionary were pulling up into the parking lot of the church, a man drove up into that lot, driving a brand new top-of-the-line Lexus, and drove in beside them. The missionary said, "Now that's what I'm talking about right there. I'm talking about people driving cars like that." And the pastor replied, "Let me straighten you out about something. I know this guy. He makes $1 million a year, and he gives away $700,000 a year to run the mission for the poor in our city. This guy is humble and caring. He could easily be driving a Rolls Royce, but he lives 5 steps below his means, so you might not want to criticize him. Would to God that you and I each gave away as much of what we have as he does. Our job is not to pass judgment, but to live the life that God has given us. Did we get that advice this morning from one of our kids? To live the life that God has given us. To be good stewards of what God has entrusted to our care. We can't know someone else's heart, but we surely should know and examine our own. Back to Tocqueville's observation about Americans from a few moments ago. What he was talking about is what we have come to see as the American dream. Now, our founders talked about the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the dream inscribed on the Statue of Liberty says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." And Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a dream of equality. Those lofty goals are not usually what people think of when they speak of the American dream. As that French political philosopher noted so long ago, for most people, the American dream has to do with achieving personal success and satisfying the desire to have everything we want, material possessions. Now, when people who grew up in poverty talked about wanting their children to have more than they had, that made sense. But hearing from that same sentiment from folks today, living in very large houses with more cars in the driveway than there are drivers in the household, it starts to sound like the 7 deadly sins taking hold, doesn't it? Do our children really need more than that when we have so much more than we need? When the American dream has become about consuming, acquiring, buying, storing, and collecting, that's when the American dream becomes the American nightmare. The suggestion from Adam Hamilton and others is that 2 illnesses fuel this nightmare. Perhaps you've heard of them: affluenza and credititis. A couple of terrible, terrible ailments. Affluenza is the constant need for more and bigger and better stuff. Anybody suffer from things like that? I already told you my story about the sewing machine, and perhaps you have a story to share as well. Another way to describe affluenza is to say that it's the bloated, sluggish, and unfulfilled feeling that results from efforts to keep up with the Joneses. I once had a neat young father in a disciple Bible study class. We were reading the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus. We were talking about Jesus and issues of stewardship and financial faithfulness, and someone said something in the class about the lure to keep up with the Joneses. This young man in the class, Rusty, a man of few but potent and wise words, simply said, "I wish they'd move." Talking about the Joneses. I wish they'd move. Don't we all wish they'd move? Did you know that shopping is listed as one of the favorite pastimes of Americans? When Americans list the things they like to do, shopping is one of the famous pastimes. One of my friends talks about recreational shopping. That's a phrase that he uses. Not to be confused with going to the store to buy something that you actually need. Recreational shopping is just going to buy things for whatever reason. The National Home Builders Association reports that the average American home went from 1,660 square feet in 1973 to 2,400 square feet in 2004. It's begun to come down ever so slightly now, but we have acquired a taste for size, haven't we? Dick and I are supposed to settle, storm not withholding, this week on our home on Wednesday, and it's a townhouse of about 1,600 square feet, the size of the average American house in 1973, but certainly not anymore. Americans of whatever sized families. There are only 2 of us, and 2 70-pound dogs. I don't know, does that count as 4? Yeah, 2 70-pound dogs. That's bigger than some people's children, maybe, I don't know. It's a really nice place that we're moving into, but I have to say, if I'm honest, it feels a bit small.